I knew from a very young age, you can actually make money through property. Property is a means to do it, but you have to treat it like it's a business. So I worked hard for a good solid 2 or 3 years. I had about saved up when I turned 24. But then just because you're saving more doesn't necessarily mean it's going to show in the bank. So I do what most people do and go off and purchase in their own backyard.
No way.
As I look back, that was definitely the worst purchase that I've got in the portfolio.
But needless to say, you pushed on, I imagine.
Yes, absolutely. I had to sit down and have a hard conversation with myself to say, this is the right path, but I need to really think about so that I can accelerate on that path.
I guess these are the secrets, right? Like that's the biggest learning.
Absolutely. But again, when you think about it as a business owner, then it changes the way you think, and the way you think then changes the way you plan, and the way you plan then changes the way you execute, and the way you execute and then also changes who else you bring along the journey to help you execute. Because due diligence actually starts well and truly before you've actually even thought about a property, and it actually continues after you've purchased the property.
When you put your mind to it,
I put my mind to it to make that happen, and it did.
Hi everyone, thank you again for joining us on this podcast. Today we have Az, an astute property investor who's amassed lots of properties and has done exceptionally well, going to share with you some wins that he's had and some learnings that he's had. So Az, tell us where it started, background, family. Tell me more about it, man.
So yeah, grew up in Auburn.
Yeah.
Spent probably most of my childhood there, and then moved into other western suburbs after that. Background is Pakistani. Yeah. So parents came here, I think in the 80s. So when they came here, it was a very traditional mindset, like with most overseas parents coming through. It's just about, understanding the way of living here, what's the culture like in Australia, setting up a foundation, save money, purchase a property, and then pay the debt off, right? So it was a very traditional way of thinking, and to no fault of their own, right? Because if I was in their shoes and if I had to move from Sydney and say move to Paris, I'd probably have the same mindset as well to be thinking about how do I survive? How do I set up a platform for my children in the future as well too? So to no fault of their own, I didn't grow up in a household where there was a lot of discussion about property, encouragement about getting into property or investing into property.
Because they didn't even have one, right, when they got here.
Because they didn't have one themselves, right?
Yeah.
But what I was fortunate enough was property is a hot topic, right? It's a hot topic in every household and every discussion. So every time that we would have family, friends over, relatives over, it was a constant discussion about, did you hear about, this such and such person purchased a property and they're doing so well, or that person's purchased this many now. So I knew from a very young age, just observing and watching as a little kid growing into a teenager, that you can actually make money through property. Property is a means to do it. I had no idea how do you actually make it work, but I did know from a young age, property investing seems to be a path that people generally take. And on the flip side as well too, you would hear horror stories as well too, where this person had to sell their property for this reason, or they haven't made value out of it, or because of financial stress, this such has happened. So I was seeing the flip side of it as well too. So I knew that when I'm able to, and I'm in a position that I can actually purchase, that I would, embark on that journey.
How young were you at this?
About 15.
15.
Wow. Yeah.
But so then you're 15. You've heard that there's all the goss happening in your circles, and then you obviously graduate from school. What are you thinking about as you go through your journey? What did you decide to do with yourself? Did you decide to go into property as a professional, or is it something that you just wanted to do passively the rest of the families?
Yeah, it was something I wanted to do passively. So I graduated and I completed a degree in business management. And I've spent the last decade in the insurance sector for the last 10 years doing a variety of different roles. But, from that period of about 15 till early 20s, it was always in the back of my mind. I was like that I want to get into the property market, that I do want to purchase an investment property. But even at that stage, I didn't know how, but I knew enough to know, I'm going to be having to put a savings aside, put a deposit ready, and then hit the ground running. So I worked hard for a good solid 2 or 3 years. I had about $45,000 to $50,000 saved up when I turned 24. And that was when I purchased my first investment property, and off we went. Had no clue what I was doing, but in my mind, I was able to at least get to a point and pat myself on the back to say, look, this is something that was on the back of my mind since a young teenager, and to be able to, in my early 20s, to make that first purchase was an achievement in itself for me at that point in time.
Let's break it down for the audience. The guy that's sitting there going, $50,000. How on earth am I going to save that today?
Yeah. You need to be clear on what your expenses are. And I think whilst it sounds quite generic to do, the power of actually sitting down and writing out all of your expenses and seeing that, it's an eye opener because it will tell a story in itself. So I think the habits, where the money is going, where the opportunities are. And it's very similar to having a business mindset where you go, okay, these are all of my expenses. Which of these are controllable? Which of these are not controllable? The same principle applies at an individual level as well too. So spending the time to go through and list out your expenses and breaking them up to go, okay, what are my living expenses? What are my discretionary expenses? What are my household expenses? What are my transportation expenses? You'll start to get a bit of a picture of, okay, what are the fixed costs that are coming through? And then you want to then overlay that, which is what I did and I still do to this day, is at the end of every month, go through the bank statement and go through line by line and see, okay, where did the actual payments go? Where did you spend the money? So I think that expense is one thing to see where you can reduce your expenditure to save more. But then just because you're saving more doesn't necessarily mean it's going to show in the bank itself. You need to have some good habits in place. So everyone's different, but for me to begin with, it was more manual saving and putting that savings aside into a separate account. But as time went on and I realized that I don't have the mental energy to keep thinking about this, I started to put auto saving systems in place as well too. So automatic transfers every week, every fortnight, going into this account as a buffer, going into this account for the deposit. So that automated system started to take place for me.
And that's like having an e-saver account or something like that, right? Where you can sort of delineate between what is my income coming in that is disposable and the income that's coming in that I must set for myself to save towards a bigger goal.
Yeah, absolutely. So that whole process took about a good 2 years to save $50,000.
Yeah.
So it was around from the age of 22 to 24.
When you put your mind to it,
I put my mind to it to make that happen. And it did, but it does take time. So as you can see, $50,000, 2 years is pretty practical to do, but it does take a lot of concentrated effort.
Awesome achievement. By the time you're 24, you've amassed $50,000. What do you do? What do you do with that as?
I do what most people do and go off and purchase an investment property in their own backyard.
No way.
So when I look back in hindsight, almost 10 years later, majority of first-time investors who are not professionals in this space will look to purchase in their own backyard in their own state. But it's generally because they want to have some sort of psychological safety and mental comfort that the property is driving distance, walking distance. I can go and have a look at it if I need to, or go inside if you need to.
Same reason why you don't go on the ASX, right?
Right.
And buy 50,000 shares or something you don't know.
That's exactly right. So that wasn't the reason for me. For me, it was more, what can I actually afford at this point in time? So based on borrowing capacity and the deposit I had of $50,000, I was going based off what I could afford as opposed to thinking about states. So that was the thinking for me at that point in time. But as I look back, that was definitely the worst performing property that I've got in the portfolio. But the root cause issue, I think, is important to think about. And that's what I've spent a lot of time over the years to think about. What's the root cause issue as to why it hasn't performed well? And there were three key reasons. One, there was no clear strategy in place. Number two, there wasn't enough time spent on educating myself to inform the strategy. And number three, I also didn't have the right people around me. So I think those three things were big lessons learned, and they were the root cause issues, because that then led to the purchase of this particular property that we ended up purchasing at that point in time. And so we took that forward as the years went on. But that's what I did with that first $50,000.
Wow, amazing. And you're right. It was the thing back then, because that would have been, what year was that when you started buying your first property?
2017.
2017. So buying the first property at the age of 24, yeah, you're right. Every time someone buys their first property, for me anyway, I'm not sure if it's an Auburn thing here, but buying in our own backyard was like the comfort zone. It's like, I get this layer of protection because I buy something that I know.
Yeah.
But the truth is the world is so much bigger than that. So what you found out was, through some research over time and measuring and performances of your various properties, you found that was the worst performing. And had you done some research at that point in time, got the education, you would have had a different outcome today.
Absolutely.
But needless to say, you pushed on, I imagine?
Yes, absolutely.
So tell me what happened next.
I think so, a few years had passed and I still had that same mindset I did when I was 15, which is, I want to continue to build and have a portfolio of properties, and okay, I purchased the first, I want to purchase the second. So the second was going through the same process as the first, where I'd started to get into the routine of saving for a deposit again. And it wasn't until we got married, my wife and I, that we purchased the second investment property. So the gap between the first and the second was 4 years. So it was 2017, the first property, and the second one was in 2021. Now, whilst I was happy at that point in time that, okay, we've been able to purchase a second investment property, no one within our family or our extended family has ever even purchased one investment property, let alone two. Yeah. At that point in time, I was thinking about it. I was saying to myself, man, I'm not happy with this, a four-year gap to purchase the next investment property. If we continue to go this rate, are we going to be able to achieve our goals? Yeah, we probably will, but we're going to be 60, 65. So that was the thoughts that I was having at that point in time. So I had to sit down and have a hard conversation with myself to say, this is the right path, but I need to really think about the strategy, the plan, how is this actually going to work so that I could accelerate on that path. Yeah. So the path was how do I accelerate on it and get there at a quicker rate?
Maybe just zooming in on that, when you're talking about capping yourself in terms of your ability to buy and accumulate more property, you would be limited by finance if you had kept going down this path. Maybe if you prioritize capital growth more than you do yield, then maybe that has a trade-off, right? Because capital growth you don't always have control of, whereas that yield you do.
Absolutely.
Right, and they're the things you're talking about now.
100%, yeah. Right. And those are things that should, in hindsight, inform part of your planning, your strategy, which most people don't have that thinking at the forefront, right? But I think that's what was needed at that point in time, and that's where it really, I wouldn't say double down, just quadruple down in that space. So I just went bonkers when it comes to education, both paid and unpaid.
And this is before you bought your second.
This is after the second purchase.
After the second property.
So after
you already started to feel this hindrance of, I bought my second, my mortgage broker said, you can buy X.
Yep.
And so what did they say? Could you maybe elaborate on that? What happened at that point in time? What was the mortgage broker or the lender saying to you at that point in time?
So at that point in time, there wasn't any issues with borrowing capacity. And in fact, I was able to purchase the second property just in my own name. So the first one was before I was married. So that was in my own name anyways.
So you didn't even have to leverage on your partner.
This was just purely under my own name. So there was enough borrowing capacity to me to purchase again in my own name in the future.
Yep.
And this was not even taking into consideration my wife's, having her to support with the finance component. So everything was ticking off for us from a financial perspective, the deposit there as well too. I had learned a few things along those years as well too around, what worked and what didn't work from the first investment property and apply those learnings to the second. But again, it was after that purchase where I sat down and go, hey, I'm happy about this, but 4 years is a huge gap. I can't wait another 4 years for the third investment property.
Yeah.
So that's when I started to quadruple down and go into the education and learning and understanding and speaking to people. Yeah. And because I just inherently had a passion for property, I was happy just to absorb the information that came from any angle, right? Yeah. Whereas, certain people will have a particular learning style and they would prefer to absorb information in that style so that they can retain it more and implement it. Whereas for me, I was just a sponge and just soaking it all in, coming from everywhere.
Yeah.
And that was the turning point for me, was that time and that money and that effort in the education, which then just went in a completely different direction, in the direction that I needed to go and I wanted to go from the start.
Yeah.
But that turning point had happened back then from 2021 to the present day.
I guess these are the secrets, right? There's a lot of noise and information coming in when you go out there to the universe and seek for help. How do you navigate through this?
If I was starting off again, and if anyone who's listening and watching this is starting off, I would say be very attuned to how do you like to absorb information, because we all have a default learning style. Some people are auditory, some people are visual, some people are kinesthetic. So I think be clear on what your learning style is, because your ability to retain the information is going to be higher. And the more you can retain, then the more you're going to be able to implement what you're learning.
You said there were some learnings that you had from the first property to the second property. The first one being you buying your own backyard, which is obviously local to Western Sydney. For the viewers. And then the second one, what was the difference between the first and the second? What was the first one? Was it an apartment? Was it a house?
It was an apartment, yeah. It was an apartment here close to Parramatta in Sydney, whereas the second one was in regional New South Wales. So regional was something that I hadn't considered, but the key learnings between the first and the second was that, as we know, that buildings depreciate and land depreciates. So that was a key component as well too. but also then considering not just the capital growth, but the yields as well too. And at that point in time in regional New South Wales, this was still around the time of COVID.
21.
It was really, really good time a good opportunity to buy as well too, like a good piece of land in an area which had good growth, but also good rental yield as well too. Shifting from focus on what's affordable versus looking at land was one. And the second was stretching the thinking out from city to regional. And then also 3, thinking about, what's the future opportunity to develop as well too. Apartments in general, you really restricted what you can and can't do. Whereas with a freestanding house, the sky's pretty much the limit.
That's right.
Subject to council approval. There's more that you can do there. So they were the 3 key factors and learnings that were taken from the first to the second.
And with that property now, what's been the largest changes, like in terms of like the biggest differences in investing sort of, okay, so you get out of your comfort zone. That's the biggest learning. Buying somewhere that's not in your backyard. 2 is buying a property that potentially has more capital growth because it has land and the opportunity to develop on it, whether it's a granny flat or something like that, is always an opportunity, isn't it, on these sort of properties. And of course, as the house gets older, it needs improvements. It can do with the second floor. There's all these things that you couldn't do, I imagine, on an apartment with a brand new and existing.
100%. And I think it's not just like even the sort of the major work, but it's even just the small things that you want to do as well too. They can just be done with getting the assistance of the property manager, just going out and getting 3 quotes and presenting those 3 quotes to you and making those changes, without the hassle of having to go and speak to Strata committee and the owners corporation and getting approval and sign off. Like, it's just really elongated process. Whereas through there, you again, that whole analogy of being a business owner, you're the property owner. It's like having a business owner. You call the shots, and you can actually decide, okay, this is what I like to do. Can I get your assistance? And the property manager will work with you to make that happen. So it's far more efficient, streamlined, and effective to be able to do what you want to. In that case, and again, if you want to be a hands-on investor and be proactive and have a contribution in the upkeep of the property, then that's a great avenue to go down compared to an apartment where it's more set and forget and you don't have a lot of, your hands are tied basically.
With the education that you had post the second property, did it change your style of investing after that, even more so?
Absolutely. I really understood how much due diligence is involved, and that learning is what really helped me understand that, because initially my definition of due diligence was just that due diligence is, okay, you've identified a property and before you place the offer and you purchase and you go through settlement, there's a array of different things that need to be ticked off, right? And that includes, making sure you've got pre-approval, making sure you've got a building and pest inspection, or you've got the strata report, you've got a conveyance to look at the contract. That was my initial thinking of what due diligence meant. But after spending that time, that much needed time educating myself, I realized, wait a minute, due diligence actually starts well and truly before you've actually even thought about a property, and it actually continues after you've purchased the properties all too. It doesn't actually stop there and then. So what I mean by that is, do you have a strategy in place? Do you have that strategy documented? Is part of due diligence. Have you spent the time to research on the suburb and the region and look at all the different factors that are involved, right? That's part of your due diligence. Have you then identified the right location, and do you know which are the good locations and the bad locations within the suburb is also part of your due diligence? Have you actually spent the time to actually get the right people on the ground to support you before you actually decide to go ahead and place an offer on the property? Have you carried out your market analysis and how much the property is actually worth and valued for at that point in time is also part of your due diligence. And then all of those things there, which I knew already before, which I thought was due diligence. And then beyond that, have you got the right property manager who's competent, knows what they're doing, values are aligned with you, who's going to help you to ensure that not only is the property maintained, but it's also growing in value in the long term as well too, is part of your due diligence. So that was my biggest takeaway when I spent the time to educate myself throughout that whole process was, oh wow, due diligence is not what most people say. Due diligence is like, I found a property and I need to do these 5-6 things before I place an offer. No. Due diligence, it's actually not an activity, it's a mindset. So that was the biggest takeaway for me from that.
And that mindset. And you talk about like that real detailed nature about, having people on the ground. What do you mean by having people on the ground for the viewers out there? What does that mean to you when you're going through this process of buying, not even knowing where to buy yet? What are you doing and getting people on the ground? What does that look like?
So I think what I've done over the years is the people on the ground are a combination of different people depending on what you're buying and where, but generally having a property manager on the ground is very helpful and useful. At times, they can actually do it for you for free and inspect the property for you. Or other times, you can get specific specialists as well too, who you'll have to pay, and they'll do this as a dedicated piece of work.
Like a pre-purchase inspection type thing?
This is before as well too.
Okay.
Yeah, so this is even before putting an offer.
Yeah.
So this is just, getting them to say, hey, I've thought of a property. This is the address. I'm thinking of putting an offer, but before I do you mind going out and checking out for me and being
independently, right?
Independently.
Yeah, not with the agency that's selling the property, not the property manager of it, but someone that you have a connection with, that you could build a relationship with, and so potentially maybe give them the rental if they can help you out on this.
If they can help you out with it, absolutely. Yeah. Then you've got your building and pest inspector as well too. So, having them on the ground and having them ready as well too, right? So it's not just a case of having it as an afterthought, having them ready to go, knowing what they can do for you is also important. And finally, that's also part of due diligence, right? Because depending on where you're looking to purchase, some building and pest inspectors will only do one or the other. They will only do the building and they won't do the pest, or they'll do the pest, not the building. So you need to be clear on, okay, are you going to be able to do both for me, or is it just one? So building and pest inspector is one. And your council as well too, and council members as well too. So at times you'll be able to find a lot of information through the desktop and do that. But there may be a need at times where you actually need to pick up the phone and have a conversation with someone locally to understand certain things or subtle nuances that you just can't understand over the phone, or you can't understand just by looking at desktop, and you need to actually clarify that with someone. So those are the people that come to mind to have as your sort of core team to help you on the ground, particularly if you don't have the time or if you physically can't be there.
That's great. And for us, we never really get a lot of people that talk about part of the team. It's the usual accountants, the strategist, that's the mortgage broker, it's the buyer's agent if you go down that path, the property manager, but no one ever talks about these other components. And you're right, like if you're buying a property that's got some sort of caveat on it, that has an easement on it, that has development opportunities, it's got a DA pending, what does that mean to you? What does it mean for finance? There's all these questions that become really important that you only can find out if you pick up the phone and talk to someone, especially if it's not all conveyed through your conveyancer or your solicitor. So good points there. I love that. Where do you go from here? Like you've got the education, you go to property number 3 as.
Yeah.
What do you do?
So.
And why?
Yeah, that's a good question too, and why? I think for me at that point in time, going from 2 to 3 was subtle learnings as well too. So I would say your big strides I had made from the first to the second in terms of learnings, and then from the second to the third was more smaller subtle changes that were being made. So for example, taking into consideration more property related factors as opposed to the location, because as you know, a huge mental barrier for a lot of people is to be able to purchase a property that's not within their vicinity. So for me, I had already crossed that barrier of location, and I was more focused specifically now on, okay, what are the property factors that I need to actually think about and take into consideration? So it was a combination of the zoning of the property, making sure it's not in a flood zone, bushfire zone area, and then also the property itself as well too. The brick homes are typically they're more resilient, they're more longer lasting than weatherboard and fibro homes. So taking that into consideration. Longevity, right? The maintenance, the age, and the upkeep of the property as well too, and the quality. So they were more micro specific learnings about that as opposed to the macro. The
Did you have any burning lessons, like where you got burnt in order to learn this from the previous properties?
I wouldn't say burnt. It wasn't forefront there to think about. It was more as time had gone by over the course of 6 to 12 months with the second property, with the maintenance that was coming through. It was through practical experience where I was like, okay, well, why is this happening again? The root cause issues, right? Well, this is happening because the property is quite old. So
let's remove those factors by buying something a little bit newer or buying something that's a little bit more robust.
That's right. Yeah. So this third property had the combination of the two. It was a newer property, but it also had renovation done to parts of the property. Right. So it was a good mix for us in that spot as well too. So I was quite happy with the progress that was made from the first property to the third, but I also knew that there was still so much more to learn, right? Because when you're going through the whole process of property purchasing, it's there's so much things that can be uncertain. So you need to be prepared for those uncertainties. And sometimes there isn't enough you can do to be prepared. You just have to deal with it at the time and then ask those questions about, the contracts, and ask about, okay, what's happening here, or what's happening with that development opportunity over there. So some things you can prepare for and some things you can't, but there was a lot of good learning from the third purchase, and that just continued with the fourth and the fifth and sixth, and it was just micro learnings from here on in. So it wasn't specifically like major learnings there. I just continued to diversify
as any continual improvement, right?
Absolutely.
It's all the little wins that you get and all the little lessons that you make, you finally adopt and then you implement in each purchase that you make.
100%.
And so I guess in the sixth property, and congratulations on acquiring 6 properties. What are some of the challenges that you go through on this journey? And then what are some, I know they're all micro wins, but what are the biggest wins that you can probably share and learnings that you can share with the audience to get to that 6?
A lot of people talk about, it's not about time in the market, it's about time in the market, but I would say, contrary to popular belief, it actually is the both. You need to have and I'm not saying it has to be exactly the right specific month of the year in a particular state, but generally speaking, getting at the right time within a market at a macro level is important. And that was the biggest learning I had when we purchased our 4th investment property in Perth. We purchased that at the time where Perth was just about to go through its growth cycle. So had we purchased that property, say, now, we'd be purchasing at a much, much higher price point. It would still be a really good, solid property to purchase in the suburb that we purchased in, but the growth that we've experienced in the short term, we wouldn't have that. We would have more so long-term growth, but we'd miss out on the short-term growth. So that was my biggest learning. Is like, yes, it is true that time in the market is important, but you don't necessarily need to time the market, but you also need to know where is the opportune time to get in. So, we are in a position we can afford to purchase again. Would I go and look to purchase in Perth? No, I wouldn't, because the time is not right anymore to purchase there. So that was the biggest learning there. And
but at that time, what made it the right place to purchase in Perth? What factors were you looking at the 4th investment property?
4th investment property. It was a combination of supply and demand. And when I say supply and demand, I'm looking at specifically how much is actually already in the state and within the suburb and within the region, and how much the population growth is occurring that's going to be able to meet that demand. But also the disparity at that point in time, I'm talking back 2021, 2022, the disparity between, it was all over the news, between a 3 or 4 bedroom house in Perth versus a 3 or 4 bedroom house on the same block of 700 square meter land. The price disparity was just astronomical. Here we're already talking over $1 million to have a 3 or 4 bedroom, 700 square meter block in Sydney, but that wasn't the case in Perth. And Perth had a lot going for it, and still does with its state economy as well. So it had a lot of factors strong for it, but there was kind of what we call arbitrage in prices. And we've seen that now that's getting bridged. Over the time, that median value is increasing substantially in Perth, and that gap is getting bridged because it has the fundamentals that are strong there, and that's what the data was telling me, and that's where I was attracted to, and it only helped me in terms of diversifying our portfolio at the time. So
of course, it's been an awesome segment here with Az, and Az obviously has amassed an awesome property portfolio, done 6 in the last 8 years. But in this 8 years, what are the key takeaways? What have you amassed in terms of property portfolio size, dollars? Do you mind sharing a bit of that with us, as maybe just high level?
Yeah, sure. So the portfolio's value is about $3 million at this point. And so it's mainly, except for the first property, which is an apartment, the rest are all freestanding houses. And it's across different states, so across New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia, and South Australia. So and it's a mix as well too.
Is that because of land tax only, or because of the strategy?
Because of the strategy.
Yeah.
It was mainly because of the strategy.
So you don't always buy because of one key factor, like, I'm trying to avoid land tax.
No.
Right? Or I'm trying to minimize stamp duty. You buy because of the metrics.
Absolutely.
And the data that lies behind each property at that point in time.
At that point in time, yeah. So, and it was a mix as well too with regional and city-based properties as well too. So that's the mix of those as well too. And like you said, quite a lot of it was accelerated in the latter half of those 8 years, purely because, as I said earlier, that when I first started and I purchased the second one, it was a huge gap of 4 years. I mean, we can't keep doing this. So, that's in terms of where they're located and how much they're worth. The biggest, like the learnings is just so much. Like we could spend forever, sharing about all the learnings because there's so many. But if I was to really sort of simplify it, you have to treat it like it's a business. Because when you think about it as a business owner, then it changes the way you think, and the way you think then changes the way you plan, and the way you plan then changes the way you execute, and the way you execute and then also changes of who else you bring along the journey to help you execute. And what I mean by that, if you take it into practical terms, is if you were actually running a business and you were to go and get a loan, the bank wants to see a plan, right? They're not just going to give you it just for the sake of it and just take your word on it. They need to actually have a plan. So you actually have to have a strategy and plan in place. And even if you're not, you would still, as a business owner, go, okay, I need a strategy before I go out and, venture into this business. So you would do that. You would seek advice from the right people. If I wanted to go run a coffee shop, you're not going to go and seek advice from somebody who hasn't run a coffee shop, but you would naturally do that as a business owner. But we don't do that when we're property investors.
So you assemble the right consultants team around you to make sure that you're making the right moves.
Absolutely.
Because they can be very expensive.
Very expensive.
You end up buying a property every 4 years instead of one every 2 years.
Exactly. And that too, if it's the wrong property as well too.
Yeah.
So I think that having that, that mindset as a business owner is very critical. And also your team, if you're leading a team and if you're a business owner, you would naturally think about, okay, how's my team? How are they performing? Are they actually playing their role to the best of their ability to help us as a business achieve the goals that we want to achieve? You need to have that same mindset as a property investor as well too, because generally this goes for life, business and property investing. The people that you start with at the starting line are not the same people who will be there at the finish line.
Love it.
And so as a property investor as well too, you need to spend that time to think about, okay, who are all the people that I engage with related to property investing, your broker, your accountant, if you have a strategist on your team, a specialist, your property manager, and actually do a stock take. How actually are they performing? Are the values still aligned? Are they actually still doing what they need to do? And if not, then that's your opportunity to decide, okay, who needs to come off the field, who needs to come off the bench and come on the field, and who needs to be off the team altogether.
Yeah.
But that all of these examples that I'm sharing as in practical terms, it only happens when you actually change your mindset as a business owner.
Yeah, because of course, I think having the right people around you has a lot to do with the values that they have, and are they aligned with you, for you? Because as we know, going through life, people's interest in being a part of your circle or team can be the wrong type of interest. Maybe they don't have your best interest at heart. And when you gauge or you have that gut feel when someone's not got your best interest at heart, especially someone that's so important in their role, like a lender, you don't want to be going down this path and taking a wrong turn, because getting the wrong finance or too much finance or too little finance can really burn your bridge for a very long time. And then there comes the question of, do I hold onto a property? Do I sell a property? There are other questions that you start to have to ask yourself. And do you have any advice around, thank you for sharing that, Azeem, do you have any information you can share about how do people get ahead in today's age? Like if they're a little bit more mature, they don't have the options to live at home with parents, to save. What can they do? Is reinvesting something that plays on your mind, or do you know of that strategy working? And what's your advice around that?
Yeah, absolutely. Plenty of people, myself included.
Yeah, nice, perfect.
So I think that's definitely something to adopt as well too. But before doing that, I think it's important. Regardless, if you're living on your own, it's easier because it's just yourself. But like in my case, and many people's cases as well too, if you've got a partner or you're married, then you need to both be on the same page to make that path work of rent investing. So I think that's always critical to make sure you've had those conversations. And from experience, one conversation is sometimes not enough. With your partner, you need to have multiple conversations, or sometimes have the same conversation 7 times in 7 different ways before it sticks. So I think there's something to be said about that. But yes, once you are on the same page, rent investing is definitely something that can work and does work. You just need to stick to the course of that as well too. And it's just purely without getting to the nitty gritties, because there's so many benefits we could talk about that. But just purely, just looking at, mortgage repayments of purchasing within that same property in that same area versus the rent that you're paying and all the other expenses you don't need to pay as a tenant. There's a huge disparity there in itself, and that's just one benefit of being able to do so. There's other benefits like, the lending and the borrowing capacity and how that favors you and so forth. So rent investing is definitely an option. And again, it all depends on your situation, but also consider moving back in with parents as well too. There is that option to consider that if it can work for your situation. And also sometimes, think about, can you actually downsize as well too? If you're an owner occupier, but can you afford to downsize depending on your family circumstances? Or can you actually consider moving a bit further out and making that sacrifice to achieve your longer term financial goals? So there's a lot of different ways that you can slice and dice it, but it ultimately will still come down to sacrifice in one shape or form. So you need to be able to make that sacrifice and stick to the course. Yeah,
one step backwards, two steps forward.
Absolutely.
And, for a person in insurance, a whole lot about property. So hats off to you, you're a wealth of information when it comes to property investing. And I'm sure, and nothing better than hearing someone walk through those various shoes that they talk about on this pod today.
Still learning.
and that's it. And hopefully that we can have you back in the future and talking about even further learnings that you've made and further wrong steps and whatnot that you can share, or right steps that you can share. But importantly is that, what a contrast, as, here you are, your parents' first generation had this mindset of, we must own or occupy a house. And here you are talking about rent investing and seeing, I'm sure, if your mum and dad look back, or your parents, your family look back at you now and go, wow, look at the way you've come, with the little information they had. It is a very different landscape today. And that's why these pods become so important, because, what our parents tell us, which is the closest source of information that everybody gets, is vastly different to what the universe is telling us today, because the world is moving so fast. Compared to what they're so used to. So I hope that the viewers out there get some quality information out of this. And yes, again, we thank you, for making time for us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here.